She heard it through a door that wasn't fully closed. That is how the worst things find you, not through open confrontation, not through deliberate cruelty, but through a gap. A careless inch of space between a door and its frame, in a corridor that smelled of cedar and imported leather, in a hotel that charged more per night than her mother earned in a month. Jisoo had been carrying fresh towels. She stopped walking the moment she heard the name Dlamini spoken in a tone that did not belong to any legitimate conversation. Low. Certain. The voice of a man communicating a decision already made, not a question still forming. Her heart didn't race. It dropped. Straight down, like something cut loose. She stood in that corridor for 3 seconds, towels pressed against her chest, breath held with the specific discipline of a woman who has spent years being invisible in rooms where powerful men forget themselves, and she understood enough. Not everything. Enough. Here is what you must understand about Jisoo's position. In the world she moved through, Korean, hierarchical, built on silence as a form of loyalty, a maid who overhears does not confront. A woman in her position who speaks out of turn does not simply lose her job. She loses her safety. She loses the invisible agreement that keeps her world functioning. Her culture had taught her, in ways both gentle and brutal, that knowing something dangerous and surviving it required one skill above all others: patience. But Jisoo was also her brother's sister. And her brother was Taejin, the man whose voice she had just heard through the gap, and she knew, with the specific intimacy of shared childhood, exactly what his certainty sounded like when he had already decided someone was expendable. The woman named Dlamini did not know what was coming. And Jisoo held the towels and thought about what it meant to know something that could save a stranger, and what it would cost to act on that knowledge in a world that had never once asked for her opinion. She thought about the paper in her pocket. The one she had been carrying for 2 days, waiting for a reason. Jang Gun-Woo would be in the corridor in 4 minutes. She could fold a crane. She could place it in his hand. She could let knowledge become his choice instead of her burden. Or she could keep walking. Deliver the towels. Perform ignorance with the fluency of someone who had practiced it her whole life. The door at the end of the corridor opened. His footsteps were already coming. Can love survive loyalty, when loyalty has already chosen a side? Stay with this story. The answer is not what you think. He had built a profile on her 3 weeks ago. Naledi Dlamini. South African national. Registered nurse. Contracted with Meridian Logistics for pharmaceutical oversight, a glorified inventory checker, according to the file his organization had assembled with the particular thoroughness of people who understood that underestimating someone was a luxury reserved for amateurs. The file was clean. Almost too clean. The kind of clean that either meant she was genuinely nobody, or that someone had decided she should appear that way. Gun-Woo had entered room 1114 with a master key, 6 men in the corridor, and the quiet certainty of a man who had not been surprised by anything in 4 years. She was reading Frantz Fanon. Dog-eared. Annotated. 2 colors of ink fighting each other in the margins. Blue for questions, red for arguments, the notations of someone conducting an ongoing, private disagreement with a dead man's ideas. She looked up when the door opened. She did not scream. She did not reach for her phone. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they have been expecting, and said, in English that carried Johannesburg in every syllable, "You're earlier than I thought you'd be." Gun-Woo stood in the doorway and experienced the specific disorientation of a man whose entrance has been absorbed rather than felt. He had come to this room to assess an asset. Possibly to neutralize one. The woman in the file was a logistics contractor with peripheral network connections and convenient access to pharmaceutical supply chains. She was, in the clean language of organizational necessity, a variable requiring resolution. The woman across this room was watching him decide what she was, and she was doing it without fear. Not the performed fearlessness of someone attempting bravado. The actual, settled absence of it. The composure of someone who had already, before he arrived, made every decision that mattered. She slid a folder across the table. "Before you decide what I am to you," she said, "you should know what I found." He did not touch it immediately. He had learned, from his father, from the streets, from 4 years of grief wearing the mask of strategy, that the most sophisticated manipulation often arrives wrapped in apparent transparency. A woman who hands you evidence is either extraordinarily honest or extraordinarily dangerous. He studied her face. She did not fidget. She breathed at a normal rate. She met his eyes with the steadiness of someone already inhabiting a decision made before he walked through the door. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. She was waiting for him to choose who he was going to be. And Gun-Woo, who had not been uncertain about anything in 4 years, did not immediately know the answer. She didn't come with weapons. She came with truth. And in his world, that was far more dangerous. There is a particular kind of guilt that does not announce itself. It arrives quietly. It sits beside you at breakfast. It watches you sign documents and shake hands and perform the daily theater of a man who has everything ordered, and it says nothing. It simply waits for the moment your certainty slips, and then it fills every centimeter of the space your certainty left behind. Gun-Woo had lived with that guilt for 4 years. He had simply refused to call it by its name. The folder contained 47 pages. Naledi had not handed it to him dramatically. There was no speech. No accusation sharpened for impact. She had simply placed it on the table the way a nurse places a diagnosis in front of a patient, with the quiet understanding that the information itself was the event. Her commentary was unnecessary. The documents would speak, and he would hear them, and whatever happened after that was between him and what he chose to do with truth. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, indifferent, luminous, a city that had long ago made peace with the machinery running beneath its surface. Embassy Row was 3 blocks north. Gun-Woo had attended a trade reception there 4 hours ago, standing in a room full of men who controlled governments with the same casual authority with which he controlled districts, everyone performing legitimacy for each other with practiced fluency. He had shaken hands with 2 men whose signatures appeared in Naledi's documents. He set the folder down. "You cross-referenced all of this yourself," he said. "Not a question. My grandmother didn't raise me to find a problem and stop at its edges," Naledi said. "Your grandmother," Gun-Woo repeated slowly. "Sounds like someone my organization would have found complicated." "Most honest people are." The sentence landed without aggression. That was what made it cut. She was not attacking his world. She was simply refusing to pretend it was something other than what it was. In 41 years, across boardrooms and backrooms and every variety of negotiated silence, Gun-Woo had never once sat across from someone who questioned his world not with fear or with hunger, but with the calm, steady disappointment of someone who had expected better. He felt something shift in his chest. He did not examine it immediately. But he did not suppress it either, and that, for Jang Gun-Woo, was the most radical thing that had happened in 4 years. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Naledi looked at him steadily. "I want you to decide whether you're the man who built this, or the man who can end it." He had spent 4 years becoming someone who did not hesitate. Hesitation, in his world, was the breath between a mistake and its consequence, a luxury available only to people whose errors did not cost lives. Gun-Woo had trained hesitation out of himself the way a surgeon trains tremor out of their hands. Methodically, painfully, with full understanding of what was being sacrificed in the process. Naledi Dlamini made him hesitate. The documents rewrote everything. Not loudly. That was the thing about truth when it arrived in annotated margins and cross-referenced manifests. It did not explode. It simply rearranged. Quietly. Precisely. The way a room looks different when one piece of furniture is moved, everything else suddenly revealed to have been oriented around something that is no longer where it was. The man Gun-Woo had spent 4 years identifying as his brother's betrayer was not Kweku Dlamini. Kweku's signature had been forged. The real architect of Seoul-cho's death, the man who confirmed his brother's identity to the network, who arranged the Lagos meeting with a smile already constructed over 2 nights of shared dinners, was Aide Coker. A name Gun-Woo knew. A name that lived in the upper tier of the Gbadamosi network, behind 3 layers of insulation that his organization had been dismantling piece by careful piece. He had been dismantling the wrong foundation. 3 weeks of surveillance. Naledi's movements tracked. Her associations mapped. A file built on her that had shaped every decision he'd made since arriving in this hotel, constructed on a forgery. On a dead man's name borrowed without permission and used as a door through which someone had walked, committed an unforgivable act, and disappeared. Gun-Woo set the folder down very carefully. The care with which he did it was the only visible sign of what was happening inside him. You already knew about Coca, Naledi said. I knew a name, he said. I didn't know it pointed away from your family. Were you going to hurt me? She asked it the way she must ask patients about pain. Describe it, be specific, do not perform bravery on my behalf. Clinical. Direct. Without the performance of vulnerability that the question might have carried in someone less certain of themselves. He was quiet for 4 seconds. I was going to use you, he said. To get closer to the network. She nodded slowly. The nod of someone who had already calculated this possibility and filed it correctly. And now? Now I don't know what I'm doing. His phone rang. One of his men. Outside. The voice was controlled in the specific way voices get controlled when the situation beneath them is not. Sir. The maid. Jisoo. She's gone. And there's a team in the building. Not ours. Gun-Woo looked at Naledi. She was already reaching for her shoes. He came into that room to use her. He left it needing her. And somewhere between those two truths, a man who built his entire life on certainty had just become the most dangerous thing in his own world, uncertain. The doors were about to be locked. But the real question was who was locking them and who was being kept inside. There is a specific kind of fear that does not live in the body. It lives in the mind, in the quiet moment between receiving information and understanding its full weight. It is the fear of a man who has just realized that the danger he brought into a room was not the worst danger in the room. That something older, more patient, more calculated had been waiting before he arrived. Gun-Woo felt it the moment his phone rang. Jisoo was gone. Not relocated. Not reassigned. Gone, in the way people go when someone with resources and motive decides they have become inconvenient. The team in the building was not his. Not law enforcement. The particular silence his man used to communicate this told Gun-Woo everything about the team's professionalism, which meant everything about who had sent them. Coca had been watching Naledi since before Gun-Woo arrived. Which meant Coca knew the supply crate had been opened. Knew the documents had been found. Had allowed the situation to develop. Patient, surgical, waiting to see who Naledi would surface to before deciding how to close the connection cleanly. She had surfaced to Gun-Woo. Which made both of them, now, loose ends. They moved through the service corridor in a silence that communicated more than conversation. Gun-Woo's hand at her back, not guiding, steadying, and Naledi ahead of him, moving with the purposeful calm of a woman who had checked exit routes when she arrived, because her grandmother's granddaughter did not enter unfamiliar rooms without first understanding how to leave them. Third door on the left, she said, without breaking stride. He processed this. Nurse, he said. Granddaughter, she corrected. And moved first. In the stairwell, descending fast, breath-controlled, the sounds of the hotel above them performing normalcy over whatever was happening in its corridors, Gun-Woo experienced something he had not felt in 4 years of systematic, methodical hunting. Guilt. Not the clean, directional guilt of a man who has made a tactical error. The older, heavier kind. The kind that knows the difference between a mistake made in ignorance and one made in the full knowledge that another person would absorb its consequences. He had brought Coca's attention to this woman by hunting her. He had made her a target by finding her first. The stairwell opened on the 2nd floor. Naledi stopped, breathing steady despite the pace, and looked at him with eyes that did not ask for an apology. They asked for something harder. A decision. If you've ever watched someone carry the weight of a choice that was never theirs to carry, you understand why this story matters. This channel exists for those who feel love in its most complicated forms, across cultures, across danger, across everything the world says should keep people apart. If that's you, subscribe. Because this community was built for exactly this moment. The safe house smelled of old wood and newer money. It was the kind of space Gun-Woo's organization maintained in every major city, unremarkable from the outside, precisely functional within, stripped of everything unnecessary including the small domestic gestures that make spaces feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. No photographs. No objects chosen for sentiment. A place designed to disappear from memory the moment you left it. Naledi sat at the table and did not pretend it felt like shelter. The message arrived 40 minutes after they cleared the hotel. Park Tae-jin. Gun-Woo's second. 12 years. The man who had stood at Seon-cho's funeral with his hand on Gun-Woo's shoulder during the long minutes when grief had no available language, who had built the organization's intelligence infrastructure piece by careful piece, who knew every source, every contact, every thread of the network they had been dismantling. The message contained one address. The Lagos warehouse. Where Seon-ho died. Come alone. Gun-Woo read it 3 times. Not because the words were unclear. Because the mind resists, at the cellular level, the specific reordering required when someone you have trusted with your life reveals themselves to be the architecture of your grief. Tae-jin had built the file on Naledi. The fabrication. The false identification. The intelligence that had sent Gun-Woo to room 1114 looking for an asset, which had, by design, placed Naledi directly in Coca's crosshairs the moment Gun-Woo found her. Tae-jin had not sent Gun-Woo to neutralize a threat. He had sent him to locate one, to find the woman with the documents and make her findable for the people who needed her silenced. 12 years. Naledi watched his face change. She had been watching him receive information since he walked through her door. She had learned the specific geography of his expressions, the way certainty moved through him like weather, visible only in its departures. She saw the moment the message landed. Saw what it cost him. She did not ask what it said. She waited until he set the phone down and then she said, quietly, someone inside your organization has been protecting Coca. Not a question. A nurse's assessment. Symptom identified. Yes, he said. Someone close. Yes. She absorbed this. Then the danger was never just Coca. No. The silence that followed was the silence of 2 people simultaneously understanding that the room they were sitting in, the contacts who knew it, the people who had directed them here, could no longer be trusted. Gun-Woo stood. Crossed to the window. Stood with his back to her in the specific posture of a man performing composure over something that had already broken. I need to go to the warehouse, he said. Naledi was quiet for 4 seconds. I know, she said. And I need you to understand that if you go alone, you won't come back. He turned. She was already on her feet. Folder in hand. The same steady eyes. So you're not going alone, she said. It was not an offer. It was not bravery performed for his benefit. It was a woman who had decided, before he turned around, that she was not going to let another person walk toward a danger she could see clearly and pretend she hadn't. Her grandmother's granddaughter. Gun-Woo looked at her for a long moment. Then he put on his jacket. And said nothing, because in his world, silence in response to an act of loyalty was the only answer that honored it correctly. He had spent 4 years walking toward things he hated. She had just become the first thing he wanted to walk toward instead. And that, in a world built on betrayal, was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever done. There are rooms that tell you, before anyone opens their mouth, exactly where you stand. Not through cruelty. Not through anything as honest as open rejection. Through the quality of the silence that forms around you when you enter. Through the way eyes move and then move away. Through the particular choreography of a gathering that has already decided its geometry and placed you slightly outside it. Naledi had walked into difficult rooms before. This one was different. Kweku's hotel suite had been transformed in the hours since they'd last spoken. Family had arrived. Cousins, an aunt, 2 men whose relationship to Kweku was unclear but whose deference to Chairman Yoon, seated in the corner like a man who had never once in his life occupied anything less than the most important chair in any room, communicated everything about organizational structure. Gun-Woo had not warned her about Chairman Yoon. She understood, watching the elder's eyes move across her exactly once, a single, complete assessment that arrived and concluded before she'd taken 3 steps into the room, that this was not an oversight. Gun-Woo had not known how to prepare her for a disapproval this total, this quiet, this absolute in its certainty. Chairman Yoon did not speak to her. He spoke around her, in Korean, to Gun-Woo, with the measured authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice because his voice had never once been questioned. Naledi understood perhaps 1 word in 10. She did not need more than that. His tone was its own translation. She sat across from Kweku and held his hands and asked him, in Zulu and then in English, to tell her everything, and as her uncle wept and talked and slowly set down 12 years of coerced silence, Naledi felt the elder's attention on the back of her neck like weather. Persistent. Impersonal. The particular cold of a judgment that has nothing to do with who you actually are. She kept her spine straight. Her grandmother had taught her that dignity was not the absence of pain. It was the decision to remain fully yourself inside it. Chairman Yoon spoke to Gun-Woo privately for 22 minutes. Naledi knew this because she counted. She sat with Kweku's documentation spread across the table, organizing evidence with the methodical focus of a woman who understood that useful work was the most honest response to a situation she could not control, and she counted the minutes the way she used to count breaths beside difficult patients. Steadily. Without attachment to the number. When Gun-Woo returned, his face was arranged carefully. Too carefully. He wants you removed from the operation, Gun-Woo said. He said it the way people deliver medical results they have already processed alone, with the particular flatness of someone who has spent the walk back deciding how much of their own reaction to share. On what grounds? Naledi asked. Grounds that don't require logic, he said. Grounds that require only tradition. She set down the document in her hand. He doesn't trust me because of where I'm from. He doesn't trust anything he cannot place within a structure he built, Gun-Woo said. That is not specific to you. It is specific to everything outside his architecture. That, Naledi said quietly, is what people say when they want to make prejudice sound like philosophy. He did not argue. The absence of argument was its own kind of answer. What Chairman Yoon had said, in the careful Korean of a man who chose every word like a legal instrument, was this. Gun-Woo's father had built the organization on a principle of internal coherence. Korean blood, Korean code, Korean loyalty, a closed system that derived its strength from the absence of variables. Seon-ho had died because he had trusted outside that system. Gun-Woo was now proposing to repeat the error with greater visibility and higher stakes. There was also the matter of the Kim family arrangement. A marriage. Proposed 3 years ago. Deferred, twice, at Gun-Woo's quiet insistence. The Kim family's eldest daughter, connected to 3 political families and one of the organization's most critical financial pipelines. Chairman Yoon had been patient. The patience, he communicated, had now concluded. Gun-Woo stood at the window after telling Naledi this, not all of it, but enough, and waited for her response. She was quiet for a long time. Is she someone you chose, Naledi asked finally, or someone you were assigned? In my world, he said, those are sometimes the same thing. No, she said. They are never the same thing. That is precisely the lie your world requires you to believe. He turned from the window. She was looking at him with the expression she reserved for the moment a diagnosis became undeniable. Not unkind, not triumphant. Simply clear. If you go through with it, she said, you will not be honoring your family. You will be disappearing into them. And you already know the difference, otherwise the crane would never have made you stop walking. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a man standing at the precise border between the life he inherited and the life he might, at significant cost, choose. And on the other side of that border, a woman who would not wait indefinitely for him to cross it. He had survived his father's violence. His brother's death. 4 years of grief wearing the shape of strategy. But no one had prepared him for this, a woman who looked at the life he'd been handed and quietly asked, is this actually yours? That question, simple, devastating, was the most dangerous thing anyone had ever placed in Jang Gun-Woo's hands. More dangerous than a crane. More dangerous than a folder. Because it required an answer he had never been given permission to speak aloud. There are things you find in the dark that daylight would never have shown you. Not because the dark creates them. Because the dark removes everything that makes them easier to ignore. The noise, the movement, the 1,000 small distractions that polite existence constructs around the things it cannot accommodate. In the dark, in a safe house that smelled of old wood and newer money, with Seoul pressing grey and cold against windows that had not been opened in weeks, Naledi found the second folder. She had not been looking for it. That was the thing about truth in this world. It did not wait to be pursued. It surfaced. Patient. Inevitable. The way bodies surface in water, the way old wounds surface under pressure. She had reached for her medical bag in the low light of 2 a.m., and the folder had been beneath it. Slim, unmarked, placed with the deliberate casualness of something someone had decided not to hide completely. She recognized Gun-Woo's handwriting immediately. The documents inside were not about Coca. They were about her. Not the fabricated file Taijin had constructed. She had seen that already, understood its architecture, recognized the specific forgeries. This was older. Predated her arrival in Seoul by 14 months. Predated, in fact, her contract with Meridian Logistics by 3 weeks, which meant someone had known she would take the contract before she had accepted it. Gun-Woo had known who she was before the crane. Before room 1114. Before the folder on the table, before the elevator, before any of the careful theater of two strangers making first contact in a dangerous situation. He had known. She sat with this information for 47 minutes. She did not wake him. She did not reach for her phone. She sat in the particular stillness of a woman who has been here before. Not in this room, not with this man, but in this specific interior weather. The moment trust and evidence occupy the same space and refuse to resolve into a clean conclusion. Her grandmother's voice, quiet and precise. The moment you discover a man knew more than he admitted, the question is never what he knew. It is what he chose to do with it. Gun-Woo had found her. Had built a profile. Had tracked her contract, her movements, her family connections, and then had stood in room 1114 and performed the arrival of a man encountering a stranger. But he had also read the crane's message and gone to her room instead of away from it. He had sat across from her and said, with the specific difficulty of a man unaccustomed to the words, "I don't know what I'm doing." He had put himself between her and a door when Coca's team arrived. He had folded a terrible, asymmetrical crane and pressed it into her palm without explanation, as though some part of him was trying, in the only language available to him, to tell her something his history had never given him the words for. She closed the folder, placed it exactly where she had found it, and sat in the dark with the knowledge, deciding, with the full weight of her grandmother's teaching behind her, what truth was worth and what it cost, and whether the man sleeping in the next room had earned, through his actions if not his honesty, the chance to explain himself before she decided what she was holding. She did not sleep. But she did not leave. She could have walked out. She had every reason. Every justification. Every cultural instinct her grandmother had built into her said, "Protect yourself first." But sometimes the bravest thing isn't leaving. Sometimes it's staying long enough to find out if someone is worth the truth you're holding. If you understand that kind of love, complicated, cautious, and completely real, then you already belong in this community. Subscribe. Because this story has more to say. And so do you. He was awake before she said his name. That was the thing about men who had spent decades in danger. Sleep never fully claimed them. It sat lightly, always, like a hand resting on a door rather than closing it. Gun-Woo had heard her moving in the outer room. Had heard the specific quality of her stillness, the kind that thinks rather than rests, and had lain in the dark understanding that something had shifted without yet knowing its shape. When she appeared in the doorway, folder in hand, he knew immediately which one it was. He did not perform surprise. That, perhaps, was the most honest thing he had done since she opened her hotel room door and told him he was earlier than expected. He sat up, said nothing, waited, because she had earned, in the last 72 hours, the right to determine the terms of this conversation. 14 months, she said. Yes. You knew about the Meridian contract before I accepted it. Yes. You built the profile. My organization did. Under my instruction. He paused. I reviewed it personally. She was quiet. The folder rested in her hands without drama. She was not wielding it. She was simply holding evidence the way she held difficult diagnoses. Steadily. Without flinching from its weight. Then the crane, she said. The moment in the corridor, you already knew who I was. I knew what the file said you were, Gun-Woo said carefully. Those are not the same thing. I learned that in room 1114. The silence that followed was the most complex silence of the story so far. It contained betrayal and its partial mitigation, manipulation and its incomplete defense. Two people from traditions that valued loyalty above almost everything else, sitting in the specific wreckage of discovering that the loyalty they'd been performing had been, in parts, to incomplete information. "I need to know," Naledi said finally, "whether anything that has happened between us was real, or whether I have been, this entire time, an asset being managed toward a useful conclusion." Gun-Woo looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know how to prove it to you," he said. "I only know that I stopped being certain what you were to me, and started being afraid of what happened to you, somewhere in a stairwell, for floors above where we are now." She absorbed this. Did not accept it as resolution. Did not dismiss it as performance. Filed it, carefully, in the space between trust and its evidence, where, her grandmother had always said, most of the important decisions in a life actually lived. "Then we continue," she said. "But I keep the folder." "Yes," he said. An uncertain alliance. The most honest kind. He had found her on purpose. But he had chosen her by accident. And in a world built on calculation, that accident was the only thing either of them could trust. Power, when it begins to fracture, does not announce itself loudly. It announces itself in the quality of a room's silence when you enter it. In the half-second delay before men who have always moved at your instruction begin to move. In the particular stillness of people who are calculating, not whether to follow you, but how long they can afford to appear to. Gun-Woo felt it the moment he walked into the council chamber. The underground room beneath Chairman Yoon's Gangnam property had hosted every significant organizational decision for 30 years. No windows. No recording devices. A table long enough to seat 11 men, though tonight only 7 were present, and the 4 empty chairs communicated more than the 7 occupied ones. Gun-Woo took his seat at the head of the table. Nobody greeted him. The Han faction had moved. That was what the empty chairs meant. 4 council members whose loyalty had been, until 72 hours ago, structural rather than personal, had accepted a meeting with representatives of the Han network. A rival organization. Smaller, younger, significantly more willing to absorb collateral damage in pursuit of territorial expansion. They had been circling Gun-Woo's empire for 18 months, probing its edges with the patient attention of something that understood it was waiting for a moment rather than creating one. The moment, apparently, had arrived. Chairman Yoon sat to Gun-Woo's right, not across from him, which would have indicated opposition. Beside him, which was somehow worse. The position of a man who was not yet certain which side of history he was standing on, and had chosen proximity to power while he decided. "The Han network has made a proposal," the eldest remaining council member said, "regarding the pharmaceutical infrastructure." "The infrastructure we have spent 4 years dismantling," Gun-Woo said. "The infrastructure that is currently, due to circumstances, a pause waited with everything it was not naming, without its primary strategic architect. Taijin's absence. Made into a weapon." Gun-Woo looked at the faces around the table, men he had known for decades, men his father had trusted, men who had stood at Seon-Ho's funeral, and understood with absolute clarity that loyalty, in this room, had always been a business arrangement dressed in the language of family. His phone vibrated once. "Naledi. A single message. I found something. Come now. Don't bring anyone." He looked at his phone beneath the table. 7 men watched him decide. She had been inside the Han network's financial architecture for 3 hours before she understood what she was actually looking at. It had started with a name in Kweku's documentation, a shell company reference that didn't match the Gbadamosi network's known structures. She had pulled the thread with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that loose ends in financial records were never accidental. They were either errors or invitations. And the people who built systems like this did not make errors. What she found made her sit very still for a long time. The Han network was not a rival organization. It was a controlled opposition, constructed, financed, and strategically positioned by someone inside Gun-Woo's own council to serve as a pressure mechanism. A manufactured threat, deployed at precisely the moment Gun-Woo's organization was most vulnerable, designed to accelerate the fracturing that Taijin's exposure had begun. The 4 council members who had taken the Han meeting had not defected. They had been guided there, through intermediaries, through financial incentives structured to look like legitimate business opportunities, through a campaign of quiet misdirection that had been running for at least 8 months. Chairman Yoon's financial signature was on 3 of the foundational transfers. Not Coca. Not the Badamosi network. Not any external threat. The man sitting to Gun-Woo's right in the council chamber, the man who had buried Seon-ho and wept and spoken of legacy and honor, had been engineering the empire's collapse from the inside, with the patience of someone who intended to be present to receive it when it fell. Gun-Woo arrived at the safe house in 17 minutes. She showed him without preamble. Walked him through the documentation the way she had walked him through the first folder, letting the information be the event, trusting him to absorb it without requiring her to manage his reaction. He was very still for a very long time. "How certain are you?" he asked. "As certain as I was about Coca," she said. "Which means certain enough." He stood. Moved to the window. Stood with his back to her, and this time she recognized the posture not as performed composure but as the genuine physical response of a man absorbing a blow that has no clean emotional category. Not betrayal by an enemy. Not the wound of a stranger. The specific devastation of being unmade by someone who called you family. "Gun-Woo," she said. Quietly. His name, for the first time, without the formal distance of Mr. Jang or the careful neutrality of no name at all. He turned. And she saw it, the thing he had trained out of every visible surface, the thing 4 years of grief as mission had buried so thoroughly she had begun to wonder if it existed at all. He was afraid. Not of Chairman Yoon. Not of the Han network or the fracturing council or the empire shifting beneath him like ground before an earthquake. Afraid of what happened to her if he could no longer control what was coming. "I can finish this," she said. "The documentation is enough. But I need you to trust me with the next step, completely, without override, without sending your men ahead of my decision." He looked at her for a long moment. In his world, what she was asking for had a name. It was not partnership. It was not negotiation. It was the specific transfer of control that his entire existence had been constructed to prevent. "If I give you that," he said slowly, "and something goes wrong." "Then it goes wrong," she said. "But it goes wrong with both of us accountable. Not with me as an asset you deployed and lost." The silence between them was the most honest thing the room had ever contained. "Yes," he said finally. One word. The most expensive thing he had ever said. He had built an empire on never surrendering control. And in one word, to a woman the world said he should never have trusted, he had just handed her the one thing no enemy had ever managed to take. Not his power. His fear. And somehow, in this story, that was the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. There are ceremonies that are not celebrations. They wear the clothing of celebration. The formal table, the prepared food, the careful arrangement of family members in order of significance, but underneath the performance, they are negotiations. Assessments. The quiet machinery of a family deciding who belongs to it and on what terms. Gun-Woo had attended these ceremonies his entire life. He had never once been the thing being assessed. Chairman Yoon had called the gathering at his Itaewon residence, a property that had belonged to the Jang family for 3 generations, filled with objects that understood their own importance. Celadon vases. Calligraphy mounted with institutional permanence. Photographs arranged not for sentiment but for record, a visual archive of an organization presenting itself as a dynasty. Gun-Woo arrived knowing what it was. A formal introduction of the Kim family arrangement. Dressed as dinner. Conducted with the particular Korean social fluency that allowed an ultimatum to be delivered in the language of hospitality, so that refusing it required refusing the hospitality itself, which in this cultural architecture was not merely rudeness but a declaration. The Kim family's eldest daughter sat 3 seats from Gun-Woo. She was composed, educated, and entirely aware that she was as much a participant in a business transaction as he was. He recognized in her eyes the specific weariness of a woman who had been prepared for this role her entire life, not without intelligence, not without private reservations, but without the structural permission to act on either. He recognized it because he had worn the same expression for 41 years. His father had told him, once, during the years when telling and striking were interchangeable communication methods, that the Jang name was not a name. It was a weight. And a man's worth was measured entirely by how long he could carry it without letting it touch the ground. Gun-Woo had carried it through his mother's silence, through Seonacho's death, through 4 years of grief compressed into strategy. He had carried it so long and so completely that he had forgotten, somewhere in the middle of all that carrying, to ask whether the weight was actually his to bear, or whether it had simply been placed on him by a man who needed someone else's back to break before his own did. Naledi was not at the dinner. She did not need to be. She was present in every moment he looked at the Kim family's daughter and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has recently been asked a question he cannot stop hearing. Is this actually yours? The answer, sitting in that room surrounded by 3 generations of accumulated obligation, was the quietest revolution he had ever experienced. No. It had never been his. It had been his father's. And his father's father's. Passed down not as inheritance but as instruction. Carry this, or you are nothing, delivered so early and so completely that the difference between choice and inevitability had never been made available to him. Until a woman from Johannesburg sat across a table from him with 2 colors of ink in the margins of a dead philosopher's book and asked him to decide who he was going to be. Chairman Yoon found him in the garden after dinner. The residence garden was the kind of space that had been tended for so long it had stopped being natural and become architectural, every element placed, maintained, controlled. Beautiful in the specific way of things that have never been permitted to grow without direction. Gun-Woo stood at its center and did not turn when he heard the elders approach. You have made your decision, Chairman Yoon said. Not a question. The man had spent 60 years reading rooms. He did not need confirmation of what he had already seen in Gun-Woo's face across the dinner table. Yes, Gun-Woo said. Then tell me what you believe you are choosing. I'm choosing not to use another person's life as a structural support for an empire I did not build and was never asked whether I wanted. The silence that followed was long and cold and entirely without surprise. Your brother said something similar, Chairman Yoon said finally. 3 weeks before Lagos. The blow landed exactly as intended. Gun-Woo absorbed it without moving. My brother, he said quietly, was killed by a man you have been protecting inside this organization for 4 years. So I would choose carefully, Chairman, which of his decisions you invoke as cautionary examples. The elder was still for a long moment. If you defy this, Chairman Yoon said, the council will move the succession. Everything your father built passes to the Kim alliance. You will have nothing. I will have made one decision in my life that was actually mine, Gun-Woo said. That is more than my father died with. He turned then, finally, completely, and looked at Chairman Yoon with the specific expression of a man who has just set down a weight he was never meant to carry alone. The documentation on your financial transfers reaches 3 separate parties at 6 a.m. tomorrow, Gun-Woo said. Unless you withdraw the succession motion tonight. He walked back toward the residence. He did not look back. Behind him, for the first time in 60 years, Chairman Yoon stood in a garden he controlled and had nothing to say. He had built his life around carrying what his family handed him. Tonight, he put it down. And the terrifying, electric, completely unfamiliar feeling that followed wasn't emptiness. It was space. The first space he had ever made for something he actually chose. Some choices do not arrive as choices. They arrive as rooms. Rooms you walk into already knowing every exit has been sealed, not by your enemies, not by circumstance, but by the accumulated weight of every decision you failed to make before this moment forced your hand. You stand in the center of such a room and understand, with the particular clarity that only arrives too late, that you have been walking toward this exact location your entire life. Gun-Woo stood in the center of such a room. The council chamber was full for the first time in weeks. 11 chairs. 11 men. The Han faction representatives seated along the left wall, not at the table, which would have conferred legitimacy, but close enough to communicate that the invitation had been extended and accepted. Chairman Yoon at the far end, his financial exposure bought him silence but not absence. The succession motion suspended but not withdrawn, held above the proceedings like weather. And at the chamber's entrance, because Gun-Woo had made the single most operationally inadvisable decision of his career, Naledi He had not brought her as a strategy. He had brought her because she was the only person in his world who had never once required him to be smaller than the truth. The council's representative, second eldest, Hannah Lind, speaking with the measured aggression of a man who understood he was being recorded, delivered the ultimatum with ceremonial precision. The relationship ended. Publicly. Formally. Documented in organizational record. The woman returned to her country with appropriate compensation and appropriate silence. In exchange, succession restored, Han negotiation suspended, the empire intact. And if I refuse, Gun-Woo said, then we release everything. The pharmaceutical network. The Taijin connection. The investigation your nurse constructed. A pause. To people who will not use it as carefully as we would. Gun-Woo looked at Naledi. She was looking back at him with the expression she reserved for irreversible diagnoses. Not unkind, not afraid. Simply present. Fully, completely present in the way that cost something to maintain. She spoke before he could. Don't, she said quietly. Not to the council. To him. Don't you dare make this decision for me. Naledi. I am not a variable to be managed toward a safe conclusion. Her voice did not shake. I told you that in the beginning. I am telling you now. Whatever happens in this room, I choose it with full knowledge. Or I don't choose it at all. The chamber was absolutely silent. 11 men, who had between them destroyed businesses, ended careers, and redrawn territorial boundaries across 3 cities, sat in the specific silence of people witnessing something they did not have a category for. A woman who would not perform smallness in a room built to produce it. Gun-Woo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the council. The answer is no, he said. 3 words. The most expensive sentence he had ever constructed. What happened after them? The motion that immediately followed, the phones that were reached for, the machinery of consequence beginning its rotation, was almost irrelevant against the singular, devastating, completely irreversible fact that Jang Gun-Woo had just chosen, in front of every structure that defined him, the one thing none of those structures had ever given him permission to want. The room erupted. Naledi did not move. Neither did he. Some loves don't survive the world they're born into. Some do. But only by building a new one from the wreckage of the old. Which kind this was? Neither of them knew yet. But for the first time in 4 years, Gun-Woo was afraid of something worth being afraid of. And Naledi was standing in a dangerous room. And neither of them was leaving. If this story touched you, even a little, then you already belong here. Mafia romance, especially interracial and cross-cultural love stories, aren't just drama. They're about trust, sacrifice, and choosing love when it's hardest. Subscribing isn't just supporting a channel. It's supporting stories that show love can survive power, prejudice, and fear. And if you made it to the end, you're not just a viewer anymore. You're part of this story.